So we've looked at how the president has some control over Congress, how Congress has some control over government of the president, but this is not it. You also have to take into account the judiciary branch. Now, the judiciary really didn't get a whole lot spelled out in the Constitution itself. And in fact, one of the major, if not the major aspects of their check on the other branches doesn't exist anywhere within the Constitution itself. Interesting, but it's true nonetheless. We're talking here about something called judicial review. Now, judicial review is the power that the courts have to look at both executive for the president and congressional policies and declare them as unconstitutional. Now, today, judicial review applies to every single level of government, from the president and the Congress, through the states, through the county government, the city, even down to the school district level. One of the cases we'll be looking at later is called Tinker versus Des Moines, which dealt with free speech and the schools. But judicial review doesn't exactly exist in the Constitution. Okay, there is nothing in Article 3, which is talking about the judiciary. There is nothing in there that talks about judicial review. But we have come to accept it as, again, another one of those bedrock foundational aspects of our government and our Constitution. Judicial review came about as the result of a court case, and we're going to be looking at that case a little more in depth later on. It was the case of Marbury versus Madison. Now, this is a case you may have heard of, or you may vaguely remember from U.S. history and things like that. What had happened in that case was the Federalists under John Adams had lost the presidential election, and they were losing the legislature as well. And so coming in were going to be Thomas Jefferson and a whole bunch of new people. Well, the Federalists wanted to try and hold on to some aspect of power. And so leading up to like the night before the inauguration, John Adams appointed a great number of federal judges. Now, the great thing about being a federal judge is that you serve for life. I mean, unless you have committed some truly heinous crimes, yeah, there is really nothing they can do to get rid of you. And so the idea here was that they would go through, that they would appoint all these different Federalist judges. Those judges would then occupy a good portion of the judiciary, and as a result, would be able to continue to give the Federalists influence on policy and government. Okay? Now, one of these guys, Mr. Marbury, was supposed to be made Justice of the Peace of Washington, D.C. And so he shows up, he wants his job. The new Secretary of State, James Madison, says nope. And he does what a great number of Americans, especially today, would have done. He sues. He takes the government to court, arguing that they have to give him his job. Now, the case goes before John Marshall. He's the Chief Justice of the United States at this time. And the Marshall Court is thought to be on the side of the Federalists. Marshall was a Federalist himself. And so the theory is that he's going to rule in such a way as to help his party. And that is definitely what John Marshall could have done. But he chose not to. He actually chose to use this as the moment to make the judiciary a truly equal third branch of government. This is the first time you're ever going to see judicial review used, and it's going to strike down an action of the government as unconstitutional. Mr. Marbury did not get to become a judge. So he goes through and really rules against his political party in favor of his branch of government. And it was really with that that you now have a true equality among not just the executive and legislative, but also among the judiciary. And this would be a power that would seep out into every aspect of life by today. Like I said, you can spend 8 hours a day reading the Constitution over and over and over again, and you will never find it mentioning judicial review. However, since this did happen in 1803, and you did have a sizable number of the framers of the Constitution were still alive at that point, and we don't have a great deal of complaints. It wasn't that they rose up saying you can't do that. The assumption is that that must have been okay. So you can see how each one of the branches, that the power isn't very specifically and cleanly cut in each area, but you do have some overlap. The Supreme Court in this case went through, and the justices on the court, they had to be appointed by the president, they had to be cleared by Congress, and now they're ruling on those two branches. And we still to this day have a great deal of respect for the Supreme Court. We look at them as being the final arbiter, the final law, and complete ruler on all things constitutional. Now, the framers thought that a lot of government activity would take place at the state level. And so they looked at something called federalism. Now, we get a whole chapter on that next chapter. Federalism is the fact that we have two layers of government. Okay, we have the national government, Washington, D.C., but then we have today what are referred to as 50 laboratories of democracy. Every state is pretty much on its own to decide how it wants to go about doing things. And so long as those state laws and rules do not come into conflict with the Constitution, then everything is fine with that. Federalism was put into place because, quite literally, you got to think about it this way. California is very, very different from, let's say, Alabama, which is very, very different from Maine, which is very, very different from Wyoming. Each state is very unique. And as a result, the framers wanted to give each state as much leeway as possible in how they ran their affairs. Literally, like I said, the only requirement is to make sure that the various state laws and regulations and things like that do not come into conflict with the Constitution of the United States, and they're pretty much clear. Like I said, though, federalism, we're going to go into a lot more detail in the next chapter. Now, going along with this, we have a constitutional republic. Okay? Now, you will often hear it said that the United States is a democracy. We are a republic. Okay? The framers of the Constitution established a republic. Now, a republic is a form of democracy, but it's very specific. Okay? A republic is a system based on the consent of the governed, in which power is exercised by representatives of the public. That's what we do. We go through and we elect individuals to represent us. Now, this is at the national level. We go through and we elect House members and senators to represent us in Washington, D.C., but we also do this at the state level. We will elect members to the state assembly and to the state senate. The idea is that the power it is retained by the people. The people, as always, I keep pointing this out, remain sovereign. They're the ones who have the actual authority within the government. However, those sovereign powers are then allowed to be given to our representatives, who then go back to, be it Sacramento, or we're really talking more about the national government, go back to Washington, D.C., and they then exercise that power on our behalf to try and make policy, to pass laws, to do all the various things that we as a society feel are just so very, very important. Now, this can be referred to as a deliberative democracy. Okay? We go through and we set up a very elaborate decision-making process. Remember, we talked about the fact that the framers wanted some space between the voters and the government itself. Well, think about this. I mentioned before, we consider it a good year in a presidential election that we get 50-60% of the people out to vote. Well, what about the years that aren't presidential elections, the off-year elections, when all you get are the entire House of Representatives and 1/3 of the Senate? We don't get as many people to show up. So while, yes, the people do retain their sovereign power, it's getting harder and harder to bring them out to the polls. We, as a society, have a tendency to be willing to go to Disneyland and stand in line for an hour or two if we don't get a fast pass to go on Space Mountain or Indiana Jones or any of the above. But people have a tendency to drive to the polling station and there's a line of 5 or 6 people and they might have to wait 10 or 15 minutes. At which point they decide, it's not worth it. So trying to get people excited about politics, excited about going to vote can sometimes be a real challenge. And I mean, you look, like I said, if we get 60% for a presidential election, we feel we've done well. Imagine if we were trying to get people out there to vote about, sewage management or something like that. You're going to have even fewer people show up. So the idea is that we set up this decision-making process, that we're able to go through, we're able to elect our various representatives to go back to DC to hammer out the things on our behalf. And then if we don't like the job that they are doing, we retain the ability to fire them. Every 2 years for a member of the House of Representatives, they have to convince us that they have done such a stellar job. They have done so very well that they deserve 2 more years at whatever that job is. Same thing with senators, okay, but it's every 6 years. Same thing with the president, but there's only, a president can only really run for re-election twice. You may say, wait, what? Longest amount of time you can be president is 10 years. Let's say you're the vice president and your president dies, resigns, whatever. If there are less than 2 years left to run, you get those last 2 years, then you can run twice on your own for president. But let's say you're vice president, your president dies, resigns, or whatever. Well, and there were 2 years in 1 day, you get those 2 years in 1 day, and then you can only run once. So we're not seeing presidents, running for re-election multiple times. But we will see that with the House. And we will see that with the Senate. And the idea is, if they're doing a good enough job, we will continue to send them back. That we will continue to have them be part of this elaborate decision-making process that we have helped design. System of checks and balances, the separation of powers that we have, it has what's referred to as a conservative bias. Now, by conservative, I do not want you thinking in terms of modern day political, liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican ideas of conservatism here. In this case, we're talking about conservative in regards to a maintenance of the status quo. Now, the status quo is the existing state of affairs, the way things are right now. The checks and balances we have in the Constitution are there and designed so that those people who do want to change it, who do want to see differences, cannot just do it because they have a simple majority. It's not, 50% plus 1, something like that. If you want to change the Constitution, if there are aspects of the Constitution that you desperately want to see changed, you're going to have a sizable majority. The American people are very much a conservative people when it comes to not wanting to change the Constitution. There are a lot of things that we do, and there's a lot of things we work around the Constitution, but the Constitution itself has only been changed, like we said before, a grand total of 27 times. It's not to be changed for, passing reasons or current concerns or issues or things like that. It is designed to change slowly over the course of time. The Madisonian system that we have set up for our Constitution is one that encourages moderation and compromise. It actually retards, it slows down the change. This is not to say that change does not happen. This is not to say that you will never see change occur. We've seen it change a lot. The most recent amendment to the Constitution, the 27th Amendment, as I said, was actually written by Thomas Jefferson back in the 1700s. It had not gotten sufficient votes to pass from the states, but then it just sort of got forgotten. But it was still live, it was still going, and they changed it in the 90s. the last major change before that would have been things like lowering the voting age to 18 from 21. The system is there to try and find a balance. Okay, there is an ongoing desire to try and figure out a way to work within the system. The system was not designed to radically change things immediately overnight because something happened. The system is designed to go through and ensure that before we change the Constitution, that we have gone through and we have put forth a great deal of thought and reasoning into whatever the cause is, that we are as a people definitely behind whatever this change is. The idea is not to overturn everything at the slightest provocation. The idea is to overturn things when they can no longer be stomached. But it has to be something that we as a nation desire, not just a faction. And it has to be something that an overwhelming majority of the people want, because it's the people in whom sovereignty lies.